What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamoda and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, man? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing good. I'm tired, man.
Can I ask you? You look it, man. Can I ask you a question though? Your shirt doesn't look tired. Why are you wearing a Hawaiian t-shirt?
Because my son, through every single shirt that I have, he just sweats like a machine.
Uh-huh.
So I just run out of clothing very quickly. I looked in my closet and I was like, what collared shirt do I don't want to look like a complete slob on this if we're recording
What
this.
what presentable
What's the
shirt?
most presentable shirt that's not totally tainted that I have? And this was my only option, this Hawaiian shirt, or I had to put in a button down, which I did not feel like doing. I'm wearing this ridiculous thing for your court. I forget the
All
line
right.
from my cousin Vinny. What's up, man? How are you?
Good, man. It's we're coming up on October. Actually, it's October 1 today, and it's pretty awesome. It's my favorite month. It's my birthday month. It's Halloween. It's Oktoberfest. It's all the coolest shit happens in October, in my opinion. So,
It's a good month. I'm not going to say. I was going to say something bad.
okay. Maybe we just jump right into the topic then.
So I've been doing a lot of thinking, just like American history. And
Okay.
what obviously there's a big question about immigration and like the future American character.
Sure.
And I know you've been thinking about this as well,
Hmm.
with immigration and the demographics changing in this country. You know, America's about 60% white. I don't know, maybe in 20 years, it's not going to be white people are going to be a minority. And I'm not coming from this like from an angle where it's, oh no, white genocide. I'm not coming from that.
White replacement theory.
I'm coming from it from more of just what does that mean for the country? Or like, where does that, like, how does that fit into the larger historical process? You know, is this a natural thing that happens to every single country? Is there always kind of tension between different types of peoples? Does the native population always eventually get replaced? Is it like inevitable that peoples are replaced through migration and those types of things? And I'm trying to explore that topic by just doing a lot more research into American history in this country because we have a complicated history. We have a longer history than most people think. I think a lot of like people from Europe or even modern Americans, they're taught that, oh, America is a young country compared to everywhere else in the world. Not really. The United States is about as old as most governments that exist today, if not older.
Sure.
The United States is older than the current German government,
Yeah.
older than the current government of France. It is older than the current government of Italy when they had
Yeah.
kings.
I mean, if we're talking about like, what when was a nation state formed and how long have they existed? Nation state is a relatively new thing. So yeah, you're right. As far as nation states go, we're not necessarily that young. But there is something to be said about the fact that we did kind of spring up on this side of the world relatively recently in terms of the grand scheme of human history. So yeah, there's arguments to be made on both sides.
Yeah, I understand the argument because I think what people are alluding to that there wasn't some or great empire that there is a great empire now, but there wasn't one before that kind of set
Mhm.
the tone of our heritage. There's they're not going to find old castles that were you will find old castles, but not ones that were built in the 11th century in the United
Yeah.
States.
Yeah, you're
Where
not going to find like 3,000-year-old clay tablets talking about like ancient American. Well, maybe just
yeah, you'll
not
find
the
some
not the
relics.
America that we're talking. Native American, maybe, right? But that's a different conversation because our Native American culture American culture. I guess that's the question.
Then just the construct of a peoples is relatively new as well. So
Yeah.
in some place like France, the identity of being French, I guess you can argue that, and I'm not an expert on French history, but from my perception, that identity of like the common folks center adopting this kind of Parisian identity that came from like the urban environment, that happened more so in the 17th and 18th century rather than in the 1500s, where people were essentially divided by their specific culture zone. You know,
Hmm.
they adopted the customs and dialect of like their local village and its surrounding. And there wasn't some dominant superculture like until really modern technology and, the modern press took place. States had the capability of essentially, I don't want to say brainwashing people because that's not the right word, but assimilating people into the dominant culture. So when I look at the United States, there's a lot of like interesting to look at it. And one of the ideas I wanted to talk about is the concept of the triple melting pot theory.
So what is a triple melting pot theory? This is probably the first time I've heard of a triple melting pot.
So we know what the melting pot is that all these immigrants are going to come into a country and then eventually all the cultures are going to melt together and it's going to create some grand culture.
Mm-hmm.
In the triple melting pot is this idea that comes from 20th century sociology, and it's drawn from a book called Protestant Catholic Jew.
Okay.
And it was written in 1955 by Will Herberg.
Mm-hmm.
And what he was trying to do was make sense of American identity and make sense of immigration. What his argument was that he was arguing that the U.S. it didn't blend together into one like American stew. The process of assimilation in the 20th century, it worked along the major religious lines, which were Catholic people and Jewish people, Protestants and Catholics being a much bigger majority than Jews, which were a very small percentage of the country, but their status and was greatly surpassed their actual population, or not the word status, their influence was greater than their population size. But essentially when people came to America, they either melted into a Protestant identity, a Catholic identity, or a Jewish identity. It is telling no matter what country your ancestors came from, so whether they came from Italy, whether they came from Poland or Ireland or Russia or Germany, what really mattered in terms of your eventual fit into American society was which of those three religious streams you fell into.
Okay, interesting.
So an Italian and a Polish immigrant might not share much in the old world, but in America, they'd both be Catholics. And their kids and their grandkids would marry other Catholics. And then they would blend into a wider Catholic American culture. The same thing with Jews and other ethnic backgrounds of either Protestant or European stock.
So this is like a response to the earlier, like simpler, like melting pot image where like everyone has supposedly lost their old identities and now just fused into this like new American, archetype. It's like, it's a bit more nuanced than one big homogenous thing, right?
Yeah. So he thought that concept was what it simplified what was actually going on. In practice, it was someone's confessional heritage, but really set their culture identity.
Like the assimilation then didn't really like erase differences. It like reorganized them around these like three confessional blocks that he was talking about. And I guess today it kind of feels dated, and I guess that makes sense because it was written in like the 50s. But since then, intermarriage across those lines has grown a lot. And there's new immigrant groups that don't index that way. And as a matter of fact, I know that there are like immigrant groups that he was overlooking, like there was a lot of Chinese people that were coming over, right? And they don't fit neatly into those packages, right? And then I also wonder how, the South and Central American diasporas and communities that came into, the United States fit into specifically. I didn't read this book, so I don't know what he was saying particularly about them, but according to what I've just learned, they would probably fit into the Catholic, diaspora, but something tells me that this wasn't written for like Mexicans, talking about Mexicans.
No. So the book wasn't really considering non-white people. It was talking about, because prior to the 1960s, and we'll actually get up to that, what happened in the 60s, had this kind of sectarian divide within it between Catholics and Protestants. There had always been, but there was a struggle between these different political machines that had existed. And if you actually go further back into American history, the sectarian divide it actually shows up within Protestant sects, between Puritans and between Anglicans and Calvinists, or not Presbyterians. There was actually, and Quakers as well, because different immigrant groups came to America, and they came from different parts of England and Scotland and Ireland, and they had different religious backgrounds. And there was this culture divide between different peoples. There was this big culture divide between the largely Presbyterian Scots-Irish and the Quakers in Pennsylvania, and they clashed. The Presbyterians in Pennsylvania and the Quakers, they almost got into a conflict with each other.
Really?
Over
like a hot war?
Not really a hot war, I would say, but the Scots-Irish settlers, essentially it was a response to the Indian Wars, the French Indian Wars, where there was this episode where there was a bad Indian raid where it killed a lot of settlers, and there was some brutal reprisals, and they went and they killed some assimilated Indians into Quaker culture, and it turned into a big thing where the Scots-Irish actually marched on Philadelphia, where Benjamin Franklin had to negotiate a peace or it was going to get deadly. So there was episodes like that. And like up in Massachusetts, there was always, not violent, but there was always issues between the Puritans and the Anglicans. So there was always this type of divide. And that was one of the reasons for that there had to be something written about religious freedom, because no one wanted one religious group to dominate over the other in the United States. Now,
so you think the founding fathers were really just thinking about those three segments?
I think that was in their. I wouldn't say that they were just thinking about it, but that was on their mind when they
was forefront, right?
That was on their mind, that they didn't want the country to be divided, but have these divided by religion, because if one group took power, then they didn't want like a state religion of a certain Protestant sect. Catholic was no one was even thinking about. There were a few Catholics in the country, and they had very little influence in the 1700s, but they were largely marginalized. Just to go back to Herbert's book, so it was influential at the time. And to your point about not including Asians, and there was obviously Asian immigration, and there was immigration from Mexico. Like there was a lot of kind of old stock Mexicans or Hispanic people who live in Texas and California who have been in this country for generations and generations.
Yep.
How are you going to tell them that they're not part of American culture or they're not native?
Right.
He wasn't really writing about them, though. He was more so writing about the difference between what you would consider like old stock Americans and ethnic Americans. Really, ethnic
Seems
Americans.
Seems like an oxymoron to me. Yeah, that's not a thing.
At the time, it was like ethnic Americans, really Irish people, Italian people, Germans from Catholic areas. Protestant immigrants were thought to assimilate better than Catholics. And that's how a lot of Americans experience their identity. They experience their identity as an Irish Catholic or an Italian Catholic or a German Protestant, or if they were Jewish, they thought of themselves as a Jew. They turned into a larger religious family, which mattered more than what their home country was. The statistics that he uses to make this case are marriage statistics. So he looks at the amount of interfaith marriages or inter-ethnic marriages, and he sees a lot of Irish Catholics marrying Italian Catholics. He sees a lot of German Lutherans marrying English Methodists. He quotes a study showing Catholic Protestant, I have this written down, intermarriage rates as low as 2 to 3%. So
yeah, that's pretty low.
So so interfaith marriages between Catholics and Protestants were between 2 to 3%. Catholic Jewish and Protestant Jewish intermarriage was even rarer, often in the 1% range, which I imagine was probably lower here in America than it was in Europe. Like, I bet that there was more. I'm just taking a guess right here, but I'm going to take a wild assumption that there was probably more Christians or Jews marrying each other in Europe than there was in America.
Well, I don't know about that, but for some context, I just Googled Catholic Protestant intermarriage rates today, and it's about 12%. So, I mean, that's like a 4 to 6x increase since, the 50s. So that's pretty interesting, just to give it some context.
There's no stigma anymore. So if you were to marry if you're a Catholic and you married somebody who is a Protestant, like it most likely wouldn't be a big deal for most American families, or vice versa. Like my sister's husband is not Catholic. He's Lutheran. Wasn't a big deal in my family, who's very Catholic, who's very into being Catholic, and they were fine with it. But also, like, my wife's Italian and I'm Irish Polish, so it's like kind of proving that concept of people marrying within their faith. But again, this book was written in the 1950s, and he was writing about very specific things. He also looked at surveys in the 1930s and 40s. He was looking at cities like New Haven and Chicago that showed over 90% of Catholics married other Catholics. Protestants, even though they were divided across dozens of denominations, married other Protestants at similar high rates. So an Episcopalian and a Lutheran might be mixed church doctrine, but sociologically they counted as the same block. He also noted how parochial schools, fraternal societies, so like the Knights of Columbus, you know what that is?
Yeah.
It's like a boys' club for Catholic men. Where I grew up,
I always saw it as that place that you rented when you wanted to have a party, because they always have like halls, and they're not using it for anything, so you could like rent them out for like a birthday party or something like that.
The Knights of the Columbus, where I grew up, they were like guys. All the guys in it were like used to be in a biker gang. It was scary going over there. They were just like these guys with their Harleys, just drinking.
Yeah.
They were all like nice. Like all the times I went with my friend's dad was in the Knights of Columbus, and he was like a biker dude. But it was like going into an old bar from like a 70s fucking biker thriller or whatever. It was cool. But they're like drinking clubs, the Knights of Columbus. They're like a grown man fraternity.
Catholic drinking club.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pull this back. So your Irishness or Italianness would get absorbed, but your confessional identity shaped where your kids went to school, who you socialized with, and how you voted. For example, so Catholics voted overwhelmingly for Democrats in the first part of the 20th century. And Protestants leaned Republican for most of I would say leaned, because obviously that's not entirely true, but
they don't vote in a block, but that's just how it trended.
They just, the base, the heartland for the Republican Party was like in the mid-ret, places like Ohio, and the big Democratic political machines were in places like New York and Chicago and Boston, and they were dominated by Irish and ethnics who were they came to this country and they were looking for political representation and ultimately political power. So it's an interesting way to look at American history, because from that, you can view American history over the past 150 years or so as this political power between the three religions, or this political power struggle, excuse me. And just think about the late 19th and early 20th century, and just huge political machines that are developed. And like I said, like in Boston and New York and Chicago, they ran through the parish system. So in some cases, priests would be ward bosses, or they would work with ward bosses. Meanwhile, Republicans in the late 19th and 20th century were at their core, the party of the old stock Americans. They were the descendants of the original Protestant settlers, the Puritans and the Yankees of New England, and the Methodist Baptists of the rural Midwest, and even like the Scots-Irish in the uplands. They were the people who thought of themselves as real Americans, or the heirs of the Revolution and the Civil War, and they were suspicious of the Catholic immigrants who were pouring into the cities.
Right. I mean, but I'm already seeing like the bent here in this book, because I get how this applies to the North and Northeast and the Midwest and places with your major metropolitan areas. But to say that like Republicans were just Protestants and Democrats were Catholic is kind of oversimplifying things. The South was all Democrats.
Yeah, you're right. So that's true. White Southern Protestants, mostly Baptists and Methodists, were overwhelmingly Democrats from Reconstruction to the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
They would call it the Solid South because
Right.
like they would vote for Democrats no matter what. You know,
Mm-hmm.
when Woodrow Wilson, you know how Woodrow Wilson used to screen Klan films and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and used to like sympathize with like old leaders of the Ku Klux Klan.
Right.
He did that. Yeah, everyone was racist back then. If you listen to the
He
things they
certainly
wrote,
was.
but he wasn't some raving lunatic or anything like that. Educated man. He did that. The reason why he did that was because he was trying to sympathize with people down there. Like he was trying to sympathize,
Trying to get their vote. He
Yeah,
wasn't
he was
trying to
trying
sympathize.
Yeah, he was pandering to a voting
Yeah.
bloc. It wasn't
Right.
necessarily like he was some raging Klansman. He was
I
literally.
won't.
It was political pandering. Was what
I
he was
won't
doing.
comment. I won't comment because I'm not a historian or very interested in Woodrow Wilson's stories. So maybe one day I'll read his book or something like that. But I don't know. I won't comment. I don't know if he was racist or if he was just
No,
pandering. I don't know. I
Listen,
don't know.
if you look at in the context of 2025, then every person from that time period is racist. What the point I'm trying to make is that he was largely doing and engaging in that type of stuff because he was pandering to a voting demographic that was that was dealing with what they would view as a race issue down south. But to pull this back, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so Democrats were they had the South. The reason why they voted Democrat is because they hated the Republican Party, because the Republican Party was the party of the Reconstruction governments. So even though they were Protestants, their political identity was locked in as Democrats until about the mid-20th century. And when these two groups, Catholics and Southern Democrats, rebelled against the DNC in response to largely the Civil Rights Movement, Southern white Protestants were reacting against desegregation, and ethnic Catholics are reacting to urban riots and things like school busing. And what they saw as the fraying of their social order resulted in Nixon's 1972 landslide, where he carried 49 states. The only state he lost was Massachusetts, and he lost D.C. as well. But that's the biggest popular vote in Electoral College blowout in U.S. history up to that point.
Yep.
And the silent majority, this coalition of former Democrats from the South and ethnic Catholics feeling they were displaced by civil rights policies, in addition to the suburbs, most likely were going to be Republican voters anyway. The way that a lot of historians see that phenomenon was this kind of an emergence of this white identity politics. So that, because in the 60s and 70s, America was almost 90% white. So
Right.
obviously...
They couldn't really talk about the white replacement theory.
Yeah, it was...
Although the standards, like the goalposts on what whiteness was, has changed. If I remember correctly, people I think it was like the Irish weren't considered white.
Yeah. It's
despite being pasty as hell.
They were too white. There were too many freckles. Oh, Hanahan, there's too many freckles on him. Oh, it's white. What are Irish? It's interesting how the definition of like race can change depending on depending on the time period. So I don't think they didn't think that they were white, but they didn't think that they were
white.
As culturally, they did not fit in, because the Irish that came into the country in the 19th and 20th century, a lot of them were very poor. A lot of them were uneducated. A lot of them were just seen as lesser. And then a lot of the Italians that came into America it's funny because the Italians that immigrate to the United States, they immigrate to two different places. They go to South America, and then they go like Argentina. Argentina is like basically...
They went to Buenos Aires.
Italy.
That was the hugest place they went to, yeah.
There were observations made back in those times in the early 20th century where these kind of old heritage types who were complaining about immigration, they were saying things like, it's funny how all the good northern Italians went to Argentina and we're getting stuck with all the southern Italians from Naples. Because that's like a lot of the Italians that do go to South America are from like northern Italy. Like my friend's family immigrated to Argentina from Italy, and they're like blue-eyed, blonde-haired people. They look like they're Germans. My wife is like, looks like an Italian from Naples. She's family is darker skin. But
they came here.
yeah, they
Yeah.
came and then they came here. But it's interesting how those observations are made. And I grew up in a place where everyone was Italian.
Right.
Like everyone was I'm from Sicily. My family's from Sicily. And then there's people from Naples and Sicily don't like each other for some reason. I don't know why. To me, I could never tell the difference between somebody from Naples or Sicily. And the people from Naples used to call the Sicilians, I won't say it, but they used to call them a word against black people of Italy.
Mm-hmm.
But where was I? All right. Yeah. So 90% white identity voting bloc, obviously that would be an unstoppable political force. So you see this emergence of what we call like white America, at least in like this contemporary sense. And what's interesting, the term white America was a term that was used by civil rights leaders in the 60s and 70s. So like James Baldwin and MLK and even like the Black Panthers, when they said white America, they were talking about essentially like the existing power structures because they were second-class citizens, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, what do you think white America even means? Before that, white America meant white versus black, the black descendants of slaves in the 19th century. During the immigration debates of the 1920s and in the early 20th century, white America was used explicitly in speeches and newspapers to argue against immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and places like Asia as well. But it did not mean that there was some united group of white people.
As is evidenced by this book that we've just gone through. I think it's interesting. It's partial, it's very specific, and I think it's very white-coded, but it's very interesting to kind of think about it because I think it says a lot about what's happening now, you know? It's a reflection on it's fascinating. What do you think?
I think you have to read it as a concept of its time because it was trying to understand these very specific sociological factors that were going on in the country. I think like how he was looking at it probably was accurate, where when people came to America, they would into a certain type of culture, whether that would be Catholic or more of a Protestant culture, because I don't hear Catholics talk this way as much about Protestants. Like, I don't hear Catholics ever saying, oh, like, that's a Protestant thing that they're doing right there. I hear a lot more from Protestants talking about Catholics. Oh, that's a super Catholic thing to do. That's super Catholic meaning that I think what they're getting at is that that's something that came from like Europe or from the old country. It's not it's usually it means like gaudy.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's usually how, if it's used as a pejorative, oh, that's super good. Like they're usually saying it's pretty gaudy.
Right.
It's like super flashy in terms of like statues and things like that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that there were these barriers because in like the 50s, if you were a Catholic and you married a Protestant, it could cause it could be like, it was a taboo. It could cause rifts between the family.
No, I mean, it definitely can. And it's funny how that's shifted, right? So like after a while, I think they all kind of blocked and the religious issue is no longer an issue. And then, you know, different ethnic divides become the taboo. And then that's not a taboo anymore. And then it became like gay marriage, you know, and then that's not a taboo anymore. So at this point, we're living in a time where you can marry whoever you want. Maybe you can't marry animals. Maybe that'll change in the future. I don't know. So what I find really interesting about this is I just did a little bit of Googling because I was curious. Because again, you know, I find the concepts interesting. I don't think that they're inaccurate. And I also think if I'm being fair to the book or to the theories, there obviously were a 90% white majority in the United States. So talking about white immigration and the white population in the U.S. isn't necessarily like, you know, uninclusive or not intentionally uninclusive. You know, that was the majority of the people. So that was what was being spoken about. You know, it'd be like, I don't know, trying to talk about the Druze people in the United States today. I have no idea how many Druze people are in the United States, but I think it would be it's so statistically insignificant that, why would we talk? Why would we meaningfully talk about them if, that's not like a huge impact, right? No offense to Drew's people, by the way. I was just picking a random small subset of people, right? But like, I just Googled it. And, in the 50s, there's about 150 million people in the United States, right? And the population of Chinese Americans in the 50s was about 117,000. So like, proportion isn't great, right? We're talking about like 1% maybe of Americans were Chinese. But what is interesting about that, and the reason why, I'm kind of surprised that he didn't really write about it, was that from 1940 to 1950, there was like a 51% increase in Chinese Americans, right? So that's a pretty big increase in an ethnic group. You go from 0.5% to 1%, but then, that's not nothing, right? I mean, that is comparable levels of, immigration as like, I don't know, Muslim Americans, to, the United States. It's not, it's statistically small, but it's relevant because of the increase. And it's interesting that he didn't really want or, endeavor to talk about like how they fit in, or how some of the other groups, more specifically like Mexican American groups, how they fit into that whole mold, because many of them were Catholic, but I suspect that they weren't necessarily coded the same way as the rest of the white Catholics,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a whole separate subject right there.
Mm-hmm.
How Mexicans, because there's some Mexicans who are like just completely integrated into American society.
Yeah.
But I think that the modern debate of Hispanics coming in, we're talking about something else entirely,
Right.
than like the Mexicans who've been in this country since 1880, or
Right.
even
The ones that got
their roots
absorbed.
go back. Yeah, the ones who got absorbed into America.
Right. When they when California became a state, or when Texas became a state. Yeah. All of those Mexicans just immediately became Americans.
Yeah. But it's interesting. So why don't we talk? Let's end this segment right here. Let's transition. Thanks for listening to this. Should we do like an ending for this?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe we end it for each segment, and then we go on and we start over.
It's better to have it than not have it and want it. So why don't we give it an
All right. Thanks for listening to this segment from Bro History. If you want our full episodes, go to our /Bro History. You get our whole recording session where we have the full recording. This is a segment from the Bro History podcast. Go listen to it.
Peace.